Today we thought we would travel outside of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Okay, I know what you're thinking. We have 1,000 years of medieval history to go at, so why do we need to look elsewhere? Well, the answer is easy. The Great Fire of London was one of the greatest catastrophes ever to befall the city, and it's a tale just too extraordinary not to be told. Over 4 days from Sunday the 2nd to Wednesday the 5th of September 1666, London was overpowered by the largest and fastest moving fire that it had ever faced. Fanned by easterly winds, it spread quickly across the city like a relentless predator, consuming everything in its path. When the wind eventually dropped and the flames finally guttered out, the devastation was clear to see, causing the famed diarist Samuel Pepys to state that it was, quote, "the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw." Welcome to early modern madness. A whole new world. In 1651, Oliver Cromwell died. After the execution of King Charles I and his success in the English Civil War, Cromwell had been the Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Great Britain had become a republic. Cromwell's son Richard ceded power to Parliament, and it was proclaimed that Prince Charles had been the lawful monarch to the English throne since the execution of his father King Charles II in 1649. The prince returned to London from exile and was crowned King Charles II at Westminster Abbey in 1661. The restoration of the monarchy was described by some as a divinely ordained miracle. By the 1660s, London was the largest city in Britain and the third largest in the Western world, with somewhere between 300 and 400,000 inhabitants. It was at the very centre of all things economic, political, and social in England, which was in the middle of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Almost all of the battles were fought at sea, the conflict being mostly over trade and overseas territories, so there was a good deal of hostility towards the Dutch in the capital. The Great Plague had been endemic since the first days of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, with sporadic outbreaks. In 17th century London, one of the worst death tolls occurred in the year before the Great Fire. Pepys first mentioned it in his diary when writing an entry for the 24th of May 1665, although the disease had first appeared in December 1664. After a visit to a coffee house, where he had not been a great while, he stated that, quote, "all the news is of the plague growing upon us." By the end of June, Pepys was afraid because the plague increases mightily and it had spread to his end of town. By then, the number of deaths stood at 1,165. John Evelyn was, among other things, a writer and minor government official. He was also a friend of Pepys. He kept a diary of his life that ran from the time when he was a student in the 1640s to his death in 1706. Concerning the plague, he noted, quote, "the street thin of people, the shops shut up, and all in mournful silence, as not knowing whose turn might be next." In the city, by the winter of 65, the plague had burnt itself out, taking over 68,500 people with it. As expected, the poorer areas of London were the worst hit because of problems with overcrowding and unhygienic conditions in impoverished districts. Not because wealthier people were immune to the disease, but rather because they could afford to leave the confines of the city and travel out into the country until the outbreak was over. However, unlike disease, fire destroyed everything, whether it belonged to rich or poor. Yes, it was more likely to break out in a densely populated area, but once it caught hold, it consumed the hovel of a poor citizen just as easily as the premises of a wealthy merchant. In 1666, the relationship between the people of London and the Crown was often tense. During the English Civil War, the capital had been a stronghold for the Republicans. Quite rightly, the economically diverse and affluent city was still seen as a threat by Charles II, as there had been several Republican uprisings in the early 1660s. The city magistrates were old enough to have fought in the Civil War and could remember how it was King Charles I's unsuccessful attempt to try and snatch absolute power that had caused all of the death and suffering. They were certainly going to stop any similar pretensions in his son. Even when the Great Fire was threatening the city and Charles offered troops and other resources, even though there was a state of emergency and disaster was imminent, the idea of having the king's soldiers within the city's wall was political dynamite. Sadly, that meant that by the time Charles took over command of the situation, the fire was already way out of control. Tick, tick, boom. London was no stranger to destructive fires, having first been destroyed around 61 AD when Boudicca and her followers the Iceni razed the town in their revolt against the Romans. More recently, there had been no major fires since 1633, but because of the layout of its medieval streets, it always remained a possibility. London wasn't the only victim either. City fires were a problem worldwide. In 1657, the Great Fire of Edo in Japan burned down over 75% of the buildings and killed about 600,000 people. The Istanbul fire killed 40,000 and wiped out 2/3 of the city, and in 1728, the Great Fire of Copenhagen lost 80% of its structures. However careful the citizens tried to be, there would always be accidents. In their houses, people used candles for lighting and cooked using open fires. Stables were filled with hay, some people even had gunpowder in their homes, as those fighting for Cromwell's new model army had kept their muskets from the Civil War. London was a tinderbox just waiting to happen. In the relatively short 100-year period between 1550 and 1650, at least an extra 330,000 people had teamed into London, the majority of them having little money. Many settled outside the walls in the suburbs known as the Liberties, which were still in the city's jurisdiction. The well-to-do lived in the centre within their spacious mansions of brick and stone, and of those poorer people who did live within the walls, they resided on the outskirts, or down by the riverside in poor quality, densely packed squalor. The city was essentially a medieval warren of narrow winding streets and alleyways. Wood buildings and thatched roofing had been banned for hundreds of years, but they continued to be used as it was all the citizens could afford. To make things worse, many of the 2- and 3-story high timber houses had upper floors that jutted out onto the street, known as jetties, to maximize space. Some of these overhangs were so close together that 2 women could lean out of their windows on opposite sides of the street and shake hands. It was hard to see the sky. As a fire hazard, this sort of housing was a ticking time bomb. As one observer noted, quote, "As it does facilitate a conflagration, so does it also hinder the remedy." In 1661, Charles II banned overhanging jetties and windows because of the risk, but the proclamation was ignored. Even in 1665, when he ordered the imprisonment of any builders who broke the law and the demolition of any offending buildings, the ruling had little to no impact. Baker Baker, Great Fire Maker. It was a proud day for Thomas Fariner when he joined the Worshipful Company of Bakers of the City of London in 1637. By the age of 34, he had opened his shop and considered himself to be a valuable member of society. He provided ship's biscuits for the Royal Navy during the Anglo-Dutch War. Now he lived above his bakery on Fish Yard, a small close just off Pudding Lane. His neighbours included Thomas Burt, the parish clerk, a turner named John Bybee, a water-bearer named Henry Moore, George Porter, a plasterer, Alice Spencer, a widow, and Thomas Blurt, who was a sexton and looked after the nearby church and churchyard. Fariner himself was a church warden. Samuel Pepys, who, as well as keeping his famous diary, was also a naval administrator, had first regularised Royal Naval food supplies in 1665 with rations that included, quote, £1 daily of good, clean, sweet, sound, well-baked and well-conditioned wheaten biscuit. Fariner's business was successful enough for him to employ the services of an apprentice and a maid. Later, Fariner would claim the fire was caused by arson. He stated that sometime after midnight he had, quote, gone through every room and found no fire, but in one chimney, where the room was paved with bricks, which fire I diligently raked up in embers, no window or door might let wind disturb them, and that it was absolutely set on fire on purpose. We know that the bakery had 5 hearths because of access to the hearth tax records. Charles II introduced the Act in 1662, which decreed that anyone who paid more than 20 shillings a year in rent had to pay 2 shillings a year for every stove, fire and hearth within the property. The number of hearths in a building could denote its size or the status of the persons living there. The baker and the rest of his household were awakened in the early hours of the morning to the smell of smoke and the horror that a fire was now well established in the shop below. Unable to use the stairs, everyone was forced to climb through one of the upstairs windows and climb onto the roof of the neighbouring house. The unfortunate bakery maid was so terrified that she refused to follow and was left behind in the burning building. She became the first, but certainly not the last casualty of the fire. Fariner claimed that he had checked to see how far the fire had spread and saw that it had not begun near the chimney or oven, nor had it reached the combustible fuel in the yard. He swore that the wood put inside the oven to dry by his apprentice were later found untouched by the flames. It is not surprising that Fariner denied all culpability for the catastrophe, considering the scale of the disaster that was to unfold. However, one witness did claim that it was over an hour before the fire had spread to any of the neighbouring properties, and he had more than enough time to move the furniture from his home before that, too, caught fire. Meanwhile, by 3 a.m, over a quarter of a mile away in Seething Lane, the maid Jane Birch was waking her master Samuel Pepys. The day before, Pepys had spent the morning at the office before going to watch a play with his wife. He avoided seeing young Killigrew, the groom to the bedchamber for the Duke of York, who he obviously disliked, and then went on to eat and drink, becoming so mighty merry that he went home singing. After writing some letters, Pepys went off to bed. He wrote, quote, "I rose and put on my nightgown and went to the maid's window, but being unused to such fires as followed, I thought it far enough off, and so went to bed again and to sleep." Pepys wasn't the only one to dismiss the escalating fire. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, looked out of his bedroom window in Maiden Lane, Aldersgate. He was similarly untroubled by what he saw and returned to his bed, declaring that the blaze was so insignificant, quote, "a woman might piss it out." Bloodworth eventually turned up at the source on Pudding Lane and was still quite relaxed about the whole affair. By then, the Star Inn, a substantial building with 29 hearths and full of hay and other combustibles, had been razed, and it's possible that Bloodworth was told to allow several properties nearby to be demolished, thereby halting the progression of the fire. He refused, asking, quote, "When the houses have been brought down, who shall pay the charges for rebuilding them?" A comment that caused Pepys to later refer to the Lord Mayor as a silly man, which, all things considered, is quite a generous insult. Bows and arrows against the lightning. There was no organised fire brigade in the city in 1666. Firefighting was the responsibility of the watch. Known as bellmen, they were employed to patrol the streets at night and raise the alarm if they saw any outbreak of fire. They had very little knowledge of how to tackle a blaze and were equipped with only leather buckets, water squirts, which resembled large syringes, and axes. Other basic equipment was stored in churches, including ladders and firehooks, which were long poles to help in the demolition of buildings. To make matters worse, a high wind was fanning the flames, and the firefighters couldn't get near enough to the fire to pose any real threat to the blaze. The easiest way to create a firebreak was to pull down the adjacent buildings, but Bloodworth had objected. The few fire engines available were difficult to maneuver, there were no keys on the Thames, and the machines had to be pushed down to the water. Many of them tipped over and fell into the river. Throwing a bucket full of water from a distance was not even going to make much of a difference to the onslaught of the flames, and, quote, "In a short time the fire became too big to be mastered by any engines or working near it." Pudding Lane was close to Thames Street, which ran parallel to the river near London Bridge. The area closest to the waterfront was particularly dangerous because the dwellings were close built with wooden pitch houses. Clergyman Edward Waterhouse, a Fellow of the Royal Society, described the buildings along that part of the river as, quote, "The lodge of all combustibles, oil, hemp, flax, pitch, tar, cordage, hops, wines, brandies, and other materials favourable to fire. Full of narrow streets, old buildings, all of timber, all contiguous each to other, all stuffed with ailment for the fire, all in the very heart of trade and wealth in the city." St. Magnus the Martyr was the first parish church to be claimed. By 8 in the morning, the blaze had spread to London Bridge, and the buildings on it were destroyed. Hellfire. The Book of Revelation is the final book of the New Testament. Also known as the Book of the Apocalypse, it is interpreted by some as a prediction of the end of days. It speaks of the second coming of Jesus and the defeat of the Antichrist. It also describes prophetic visions of a seven-headed dragon, a serpent, and the beast, whose number is 666. Given that smaller fires broke out regularly and seeing how flammable the capital was, predictions of an apocalyptic firestorm were hardly surprising. Added to this was the disdain for the frivolities of the wealthy in Restoration London. Charles and his court were seen to be leading a decadent lifestyle of low morals. The king had a bevy of mistresses and at least a dozen illegitimate children. Despite this, he was unable to produce an heir, so to make matters worse, he named his Catholic brother James, Duke of York, as his successor. The Puritan laws that banned things like sports, theatre, and Christmas brought in by Oliver Cromwell during the Protectorship were repealed by the king. Bawdy Restoration comedy became popular, as did Restoration literature, and at court, there were libertines such as Lord Rochester who challenged moral principles and had no sexual restraint. Along with mystics and fortune-tellers, the Puritans predicted a reckoning for the city of London like the wrath brought down on Sodom and Gomorrah. In 1642, Francis Potter published an interpretation of the number 666. After reading it, Pepys noted that, quote, "Certainly this year of 1666 will be a year of great action, but what the consequences of it will be, God knows." As early as 1597, a pamphlet had been published that foretold 1666 as the Year of the Beast. Anonymously written, it was titled Babylon is Fallen. The Puritans especially were wary of the vengeful hand of God. In 1628, when fire destroyed 100 houses in Banbury, the rector William Whately delivered a scathing lesson against the perils of sinfulness. The fire had begun in a malt house on a Sunday, which only confirmed his fears. Whately called his sermon, "Sin No More Banbury." After fire struck the town of Dorchester, Minister John White found that the people were much improved in their behaviour, as they were told that their sinfulness, especially Sabbath breaking, was the cause of the blaze. After all, the book of Jeremiah warned that a consequence of breaking the Sabbath would be a fire that shall not be quenched. The Tiverton fire of 1612, which burned down 290 houses, and the Oxford fire of 1644, which destroyed over 300, both began on Sundays, as did the Great Fire of London, which was yet to come. This only reinforced the idea that God was out for vengeance. As the date of the Great Fire approached, there was a sense of foreboding by many. The war and the plague were a huge concern to the people, and as a consequence, the economy had taken a hit. Many felt that a Dutch invasion was on the horizon. It had been a particularly hot summer. Temperatures in July and August 1666 were above average, and there had been a significant lack of rainfall in the southeast of England that had gone on since the previous November. Water levels in the river were quite low, and John Evelyn would later remark on the long and extraordinary drought in the months leading up to the fire. Burn Baby Burn. At around 7 AM, Pepys woke up and, after looking through the window, decided that the fire was still too far enough away to be of any concern and was, quote, "not so much as it was." It was when Jane the maid told him that more than 300 houses had been burned down that he realised the seriousness of the situation. Pepys walked up to the tower to get a better view and saw, quote, "an infinite great fire on this and the other side end of the bridge." Pepys wasn't the only person to react slowly to the threat of the blaze. A schoolboy at Westminster named William Taswell only realised that there was a fire when he saw people, quote, "running to and fro in a seeming disquietude and consternation." By that time, it was somewhere between 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning. It would seem that people liked to laze around in bed on a Sunday morning, even in the 17th century. Pepys said, quote, "On going down to the waterside and there got a boat, I saw a lamentable fire. Everybody endeavouring to remove their goods and flinging into the river. Poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. And among other things, the poor pigeons, I perceive, were loath to leave their houses, but hovered above the windows and balconies till they were, some of them, burned, their wings, and fell down. Having stayed and in an hour's time seen the fire rage every way, and nobody to my sight endeavouring to quench it, but to remove their goods and leave all to the fire, and having seen it get as far as the steelyard, and the wind mighty high and driving it into the city, and everything after so long a drought proving combustible, even the very stones of churches. It would seem that most Londoners were too busy trying to save their possessions and flee the city, rather than helping Bloodworth. Pepys was called to court and asked to tell his account to King Charles and his brother, the Duke of York. Pepys told the king that, quote, "Unless his majesty did command houses to be pulled down, nothing could stop the fire." Pepys was ordered to find the Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth and command him to spare no houses, but to pull down before the fire every way. Travelling down to St. Paul's Cathedral by walking along Watling Street as well as he could, Pepys noted that, quote, "Every creature coming away loaden with goods to save, and here and there sick people carried away in beds, extraordinary goods carried in carts and on backs." When he found the Lord Mayor, Pepys said he was, quote, "like a man spent with a handkerchief about his neck. To the king's message he cried like a fainting woman, 'Lord, what can I do? I am spent, people will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it.'" Bloodworth said, quote, "that he needed no more soldiers, and that for himself he must go and refresh himself, having been up all night, seeing people all almost distracted, and no manner of means used to quench the fire." Many seemed oblivious to the danger that they were in. The diplomat Franciscus de Rappaccini, secretary to Queen Christina of Sweden, spent lunch in a fine company of Londoners, who he considered quite cheerful for so perilous and sorry a time. However, they weren't so jovial when they returned to the city to find that their houses had gone up in fire and smoke. Pepys and his wife also spent a pleasant lunch at home with some friends, having, quote, "an extraordinarily good dinner and as merry as at this time we could be." Pepys returned to the city streets that evening to find chaos. Quote, "The streets full of nothing but people and horses and carts loaded with goods ready to run over one another." Rappaccini noted that, quote, "the fire was spreading with such fury that it was thought that about 100 houses were being burnt every hour. The wind drove the flames to the west of Pudding Lane. Even those houses to the north of London Bridge that had been constructed of a stronger and more stately way of building after the fire of 1633 were destroyed." As dawn came up on Monday the 3rd of September, it was obvious that this was not any ordinary blaze. At 4 a.m, Pepys was pleased when, quote, "Lady Batten sent a cart to carry away all my money and plate and best things." Now the king took drastic action. He removed Bloodworth from his station and put his brother James, Duke of York, in charge of the firefighting. Charles even went along to help. With a shortage of water, trying to douse out the fire was not the answer. York paid soldiers in bread, cheese, and beer to man command posts and maintain order. Despite their efforts, by the afternoon, John Evelyn noted that the entire south part of the city was on fire. By the evening, he described how the flames seemed to leap from house to house and street to street. Quote, "The Thames covered with goods floating, the noise and cracking and thunder of the impetuous flames, the shrieking of women and children, the hurry of people, the fall of towers, houses and churches, and the air hot and inflamed." Tuesday was the worst day. Once one of London's main commercial areas since medieval times, Cheapside was destroyed. The flames moved east towards the Tower of London with its stores of gunpowder. The soldiers had to work alone. They waited all day for help from the Duke of York and his firefighters, but they were overwhelmed in the city's west. Horrified Pepys dug a pit in the garden and buried all the papers of his office, their wine, and Parmesan cheese. Firestarter. Everyone wanted someone to blame. Catholics were the first to come under suspicion along with foreigners, especially the Dutch. After all, there was a war going on. The London Gazette noted that strangers, quote, "Dutch and French were apprehended upon suspicion that they contributed mischievously to it, who are all imprisoned and informations prepared to make a severe inquisition." Taswell noted how, quote, The ignorant and deluded mob hurried with a kind of frenzy their rage against the Roman Catholics and Frenchmen. A Mr. Light claimed to have had a conversation with a zealous papist a few weeks before the fire, who asked him, quote, "You expect great things in 66 and think that Rome will be destroyed, but what if it be London?" As far as Elizabeth Styles was concerned, she blamed the French, claiming that a Frenchman had told her that by October there would not be a house left between Temple Bar and London Bridge. One Frenchman was battered with an iron bar, another was almost dismembered. Some thought Dutch merchants had retaliated for the destruction of about 150 Dutch merchant ships and the torching of the town of West Terschelling just a month before. The successful strike had been celebrated in London with bells and bonfires. However, in Amsterdam, the desolation and mourning caused riots. Earlier in the spring of 1666, there had been a conspiracy to assassinate Charles II, take over the government, and set fire to the city. The plotters even discussed letting down the portcullis to keep any help from getting inside the walls. The trial of the parliamentarians, led by William Saunders and John Rathbone, were held at the Old Bailey, where it was discovered that the conspirators had support from Holland to carry out their hellish design on the anniversary of Cromwell's death. That date just so happened to be the 3rd of September. One of the first people to come under suspicion for starting the fire was the astrologer William Lilly. He published a pamphlet titled Monarchy or No Monarchy in 1651. In it, some illustrations predicted the future of the nation in a fire and brimstone way. They showed scenes of naval warfare, starvation, rodent infestations, large numbers of death, and most importantly for the accusers, a city being destroyed by fire. So it's hardly surprising that he was taken in for questioning. But then a French watchmaker named Robert Hubert stepped forward and confessed. However, from the get-go, his tale didn't make much sense. He claimed to have started the blaze in Westminster, but the fire never even reached that far, so he changed his story, saying he had thrown a firebomb into the bakery on Pudding Lane. He was under the illusion that he was a French spy and an agent of the Pope. It was obvious that the man was mentally unwell. At his trial, the Earl of Clarendon referred to him as a poor, wretched man, and even the judge didn't believe him. Unfortunately, Hubert never wavered from his account, and he was scapegoated. The state felt it had no choice but to hang him. It was later discovered that he did not even arrive in London until 2 days after the fire had begun. Rise like a phoenix. Finally, on Wednesday the 5th, probably because of the demolition program, it was over. The fire ended at Pye Corner in the west of the city. London was destroyed. Dozens of churches had been gutted, along with thousands of homes, London's only bridge, and St. Paul's Cathedral, which was now a sad ruin. Undergoing restoration, its scaffolding had caught fire and the lead roof had melted. The people wandered around lost and in a daze. Evelyn, quote, "went on foot with extraordinary difficulty, clambering over heaps of yet smoking rubbish, the ground under my feet so hot as made not only sweat, but even burnt the soles of my shoes." To the north of the city, he observed 200,000 refugees ready to perish for hunger and destitution. Traditionally, there are only 6 recorded deaths attributed to the Great Fire. The true number may never be known. Computed figures put the material destruction at around 13,500 houses, 86 parish churches, 44 company halls, several buildings of importance including St. Paul's and the Royal Exchange, several city prisons, and 3 city gates. In monetary terms, the loss was estimated at about 9 to 10 million. The rebuilding of the capital began with fire-resistant bricks, although for those living in London, it was clear that things would never be the same again. Months later, in February of the following year, Pepys said, quote, "I still could not sleep till almost 2 in the morning through thoughts of fire." He made his last diary entry in 1669. Pepys went on to serve as Secretary of the Admiralty and as an MP, and died in 1703, aged 70. Fariner rebuilt his business in Pudding Lane after the fire. He died just over 4 years later in 1670 when he was about 55. Desperate to distance himself from what was more than likely just an accident, he and his family were under pressure to show that their ovens had been put out properly. So Fariner, along with his children, signed the bill that falsely accused the suspect Robert Hubert of starting the fire. 3 members of the Fariner family were also on the jury that convicted the Frenchman. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please let us know down in the comments what you think and if you want to see more long-form documentaries like this. I hope everyone has an awesome time celebrating New Year's, and I'll see you in 2025. Cheers!